First story. So, let me take you back a few years ago when I was 27, stuck in a job I absolutely hated. I worked as an account manager for a mid-sized marketing firm. You know the type: endless calls, chasing clients for approvals, and having to deal with urgent emails at all hours. I wasn't happy, but I stayed because the money was okay, and I felt like I had nowhere else to go. Then, one day, an opportunity came up. A friend of mine, Sarah, worked for a much cooler, more prestigious company in tech, and she told me they had an opening for a project manager. It was everything I wanted: more creative freedom, better pay, and a chance to work with cutting-edge companies. Plus, the role felt like a perfect fit for my skills. Sarah was kind enough to refer me, and I was beyond excited. I nailed the first 2 rounds of interviews. Everything was going perfectly. The hiring manager seemed genuinely impressed by my experience, and Sarah gave me great feedback, saying her colleagues thought I'd be a great addition to the team. I remember going to bed the night after the second interview, feeling like I could actually see my life changing for the better. But then came the final round, the big one, a presentation. The task was simple enough: create a plan for how I would handle a hypothetical project. They gave me the specifics: a tight deadline, a difficult client, budget constraints, etc. I had about a week to put it together, and I felt pretty confident going in. I spent hours crafting the perfect slide deck, rehearsing my talking points, and even ran the presentation by Sarah, who gave me some useful feedback. The day of the final interview came, and I was pumped. I logged into the Zoom call 10 minutes early, checked my audio, video, and slides about 3 times before anyone else joined. Everything seemed fine. Then, as the team joined, my nerves kicked in. But it was fine: I've done presentations before, and I told myself this was no different. I launched into the presentation, hitting all the key points. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, until about 10 minutes in, when one of the panelists, an older guy who hadn't said much until then, suddenly asked, "Can you explain this part again? It doesn't seem to align with the rest of the budget projection." Confused, I glanced at the slide, and my stomach dropped. I had made a huge error in the budget breakdown. Somehow, I had mixed up 2 columns in the spreadsheet and completely miscalculated the project's costs. I tried to recover by quickly explaining it away, but it was too late. That one mistake completely derailed the rest of the presentation. The panelists kept asking questions, pointing out other inconsistencies, and suddenly, I felt like I was drowning in my own failure. The worst part? I knew how easy it would have been to avoid that mistake. All I had to do was double-check the numbers. I'd gone over the content 100 times, but somehow overlooked the most crucial part. By the time the call ended, I knew I wasn't getting the job. And sure enough, 2 days later, I received the polite rejection email. I was devastated. I didn't even want to tell Sarah what had happened, though I eventually did. She tried to comfort me, saying it was just one opportunity and there would be others. But at that moment, it felt like the world had closed a door on me, and I wasn't sure when or if it would ever open again. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. After sulking for about a week, I realized I couldn't go back to my old job. I had tasted the possibility of something better, and I couldn't unsee it. So, instead of feeling sorry for myself, I started applying to similar roles. This time, I was more thorough with my applications and presentations, triple-checking everything before submitting. I also started taking project management courses online, honing my skills and trying to turn that failure into something productive. About 3 months later, I got another interview for a similar role at a different tech company. This time, I was even more prepared. I went into the interview with a renewed sense of determination, and I didn't just nail the presentation, I crushed it. I got the job. That one mistake in the first interview ended up being the best thing that could have happened to me. It forced me to take a hard look at myself and what I wanted out of my career. It pushed me to be better, and ultimately, it led me to a job that I love far more than I ever could have imagined. I'm now 2 years into that role, and while I still think back to that failed presentation every now and then, it's more as a reminder of how far I've come. So, if you've ever had a career setback that feels like the end of the world, trust me when I say it's not. Sometimes, those moments are exactly what you need to push yourself toward something even better. Just don't forget to check your numbers. Second story. I was never much of a hiker. Actually, that's an understatement. I was the kind of person who considered walking to my car a decent amount of outdoor time. But last year, during the early days of summer, my girlfriend MIA convinced me to join her and her friends on a hiking trip. They'd been planning this for weeks, and apparently, it was some sort of tradition they had. Every year they tackled a new trail in a different national park. This time, it was Mount Mitchell, the highest peak in the eastern United States. I had never even heard of it before, but the way MIA described it made it sound like a casual weekend stroll. She kept saying, "It's not going to be that bad, I promise." Of course, she failed to mention that her idea of not that bad and mine were entirely different. So, like a fool, I agreed to tag along. I bought a cheap pair of hiking boots, borrowed a backpack from a friend, and stocked up on protein bars and water bottles. I figured it couldn't be that hard, right? People hike all the time, and I wasn't exactly out of shape, just unacquainted with nature, let's say. We set off early on a Saturday morning. The drive there was beautiful, with winding roads through lush forests. MIA and her friends were buzzing with excitement, talking about past hikes and all the amazing views they'd seen. I sat quietly in the back seat, feeling a bit out of place, but trying to stay optimistic. When we arrived at the base of Mount Mitchell, the air was cool and crisp, and I actually felt a little excited. The trailhead looked pretty harmless, a wide dirt path that disappeared into the trees. I remember thinking, this will be fine. Just a long walk in the woods. Boy, was I wrong. The first mile or so was pleasant enough. We walked through a forest of spruce and fir trees, the sunlight filtering through the branches in these beautiful beams of light. MIA pointed out different wildflowers along the way, and I tried to act like I knew what she was talking about. But then, the trail started to get steeper. Like, a lot steeper. The dirt path turned into a narrow, rocky incline, and I could feel my calves burning with each step. MIA and her friends were moving along at a good pace, but I was already lagging behind, trying to catch my breath and cursing under it at the same time. I'm pretty sure no one noticed my struggle, everyone was too busy enjoying the adventure. By the third mile, I was in full-on survival mode. My legs felt like they were filled with concrete, and I could feel every muscle in my body protesting with each step. The trail kept getting steeper, and the rocks turned into full-on boulders we had to scramble over. There were sections where I literally had to climb on all fours, trying not to look down because the drop beside the trail was suddenly a lot more intimidating. At some point, MIA looked back at me and asked if I was okay. I wasn't, but I wasn't about to admit it. Instead, I plastered on a fake smile and said, "Yeah, just taking in the view." She gave me this skeptical look but didn't push it. Then, about halfway up, things took a turn for the worse. The weather changed in an instant. One minute, we were sweating in the sun, and the next, we were surrounded by thick fog. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind started whipping through the trees. It felt like we had walked into a completely different world. I'll never forget how eerie it was. The fog was so dense that we could barely see 5 feet in front of us. The trail markers, which had been easy to spot before, were suddenly almost impossible to find. We stopped for a moment, huddling together as we tried to figure out which way to go. One of Mia's friends, Jake, said he thought he knew the way, so we followed him. But after about 20 minutes, it became clear we were lost. The trail was gone, and we were wandering aimlessly through a rocky section of the mountain, the fog making it impossible to get our bearings. The realization hit me hard. We were on a mountain, in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea how to get back. I felt panic rising in my chest. This was supposed to be a fun hike, a chance for me to bond with MIA and her friends. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare. I could see the worry on everyone's faces, though no one wanted to say the obvious: we were in trouble. After what felt like hours of stumbling around, we finally came across another group of hikers who had a GPS device. They were able to guide us back to the main trail, but by that point, I was completely spent. Every muscle in my body ached, and I was freezing cold from the sudden change in weather. I kept my head down, focused on just putting one foot in front of the other, and tried to block out the fear of getting lost again. When we finally made it to the summit, I didn't feel the rush of accomplishment I had expected. I felt exhausted, mentally and physically. Everyone else was celebrating, taking pictures and soaking in the view, but all I could think about was how we still had to hike all the way back down. The descent was brutal. My legs were so wobbly from the climb that I kept tripping over rocks, and my knees felt like they were going to give out at any moment. MIA stayed by my side the whole time, giving me encouraging smiles and trying to make conversation, but I was too tired to respond. By the time we got back to the car, I was done. I collapsed into the back seat and barely said a word on the drive home. But here's the thing, I'm glad I did it. That hike was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and not just physically. It pushed me way out of my comfort zone, forced me to confront my own limits, and showed me that I'm capable of more than I thought. I've always been someone who avoided challenges, who preferred the easy way out, but after that experience, something shifted in me. Now, I'm not saying I've turned into a hardcore adventurer or anything, but I've started seeking out more challenges in my life. I've taken up running, something I never thought I'd enjoy, and I've even gone on a few more hikes since then. Each time, I feel a little stronger, a little more confident. That hike up Mount Mitchell wasn't just a physical test, it was a mental one. And while it was miserable at the time, it changed me in ways I didn't expect. Sometimes, the hardest things are the ones that help you grow the most. So, if you ever get the chance to push yourself, whether it's on a hike or something else, take it. You might surprise yourself. Third story. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers. In fact, before this story, I had never even considered it. But last summer, while on a solo road trip through the Pacific Northwest, I made a split-second decision that ended up changing my entire outlook on life. Let me set the scene. I was on day 5 of a 2-week trip, having planned this journey as a kind of escape. My job at the time was soul-crushing, my relationship was fizzling out, and I felt completely stuck. I needed time to clear my head, so I packed up my old Subaru, grabbed a few camping essentials, and hit the road. No real itinerary, just a vague idea of heading north, up through Oregon and Washington, maybe into Canada if I felt like it. It was the kind of trip I thought would help me to find myself, or whatever people say about solo adventures. But so far, it had just been me, some playlists, and a lot of fast food. Don't get me wrong, the landscapes were beautiful, endless forests, misty mountains, the kind of scenery you'd see in a nature documentary, but I was starting to feel more disconnected than before. Like the further I drove, the more lost I became. On this particular day, I was driving along a winding highway somewhere in Oregon. I'd just left a small town where I'd filled up on gas and grabbed a greasy breakfast sandwich. The sun was still low in the sky, and I was the only car on the road for miles. The quiet was eerie, but kind of peaceful too, like the world had hit pause for a moment. That's when I saw him, the guy standing by the side of the road, thumb out, looking for a ride. He was in his mid-30s, scruffy beard, wearing a flannel shirt and a backpack that looked like it had seen better days. Normally, I'd just keep driving. My parents drilled stranger danger into my head pretty hard growing up, but something about him made me slow down. Maybe it was the emptiness of the road, or maybe I was just tired of being alone. Before I knew it, I had pulled over, and the guy jogged up to the car with a grateful smile. "Thanks, man," he said, throwing his bag in the back and hopping into the passenger seat. His name was Lucas, and he told me he was headed north, same as me. No specific destination, just wherever the road takes me. We started talking, and it didn't take long for me to realize Lucas wasn't your typical hitchhiker. He wasn't running away from anything, didn't seem down on his luck, and wasn't trying to bum money off me. Instead, he had this infectious, carefree energy that drew me in. He was the kind of guy who made you feel like life was an adventure, not a series of obligations and checkboxes to tick off. Lucas told me he had been on the road for over a year, just wandering around, picking up odd jobs where he could and crashing with friends or sleeping under the stars. I asked him if he ever got tired of it, of not having a permanent place to call home, and he laughed. Nah, man. I used to work a corporate job in San Francisco, had a nice apartment, steady pay, all that. But one day I just woke up and realized it wasn't what I wanted. So, I sold everything and left. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me thought he was crazy, who gives up security like that? But another part of me was jealous. I had always been the type to play it safe, to do the responsible thing. I went to college, got a steady job, followed the script. And yet here I was, on a road trip trying to figure out why I felt so empty inside. As we drove, Lucas shared stories from his travels, about the people he'd met, the places he'd seen, and the strange coincidences that seemed to happen when he stopped worrying about the future and just followed his instincts. He talked about camping out on remote beaches in Mexico, learning to surf from locals who didn't speak a word of English, and hiking to hidden waterfalls in the middle of nowhere. But it wasn't just the adventures that struck me. It was his attitude toward life. Lucas didn't have a plan. He didn't know where he'd be next week, let alone next year. And yet, he seemed more at peace with himself than anyone I'd ever met. Eventually, we pulled into a small town to grab lunch. We found a diner with greasy food and a jukebox playing old rock songs. As we ate, Lucas asked me about my life, my job, my relationship, what I wanted. I told him the truth, I didn't know anymore. I had a decent job, but I hated it. My girlfriend and I were growing apart, but neither of us wanted to admit it. I felt trapped. Lucas listened, then shrugged. Why not change it? I laughed. It's not that easy, man. Why not? He asked, genuinely confused. You've got a car, you've got time. If you hate your job, leave. If your relationship isn't working, end it. Life's too short to waste on things that don't make you happy. I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't get it, but the truth was, I didn't have a good answer. I had spent so long doing what I thought I was supposed to do that I hadn't even considered what I wanted to do. After lunch, we got back on the road. Lucas told me about a spot not too far ahead, a secluded lake where he liked to camp. I didn't have any plans, so I figured, why not? We drove for another couple of hours, then parked at a trailhead and hiked about a mile into the woods. Sure enough, we came upon this beautiful lake, completely still, surrounded by trees. It looked like something out of a postcard. We set up camp, built a small fire, and spent the evening talking. As the stars came out, I realized I hadn't thought about work or my relationship once all day. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt present. Like I was actually living my life, not just going through the motions. The next morning, Lucas packed up his things and said he was moving on. He offered to stick around, but I knew it was time for him to go. We shook hands, and he gave me one last piece of advice before he disappeared down the trail: trust your gut. It knows more than you think. I sat by the lake for a long time after he left, thinking about what he had said. And for the first time, I started to imagine a different kind of life, one where I wasn't so afraid to take risks, to make changes, to follow my gut. When I got back to my car, I didn't turn around and head home. Instead, I kept driving north, no destination in mind, just seeing where the road would take me. That trip didn't magically solve all my problems, but it did give me clarity. When I got home, I quit my job. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right move. As for my relationship, well, that ended too. But for the first time in my life, I felt okay with the uncertainty. I didn't have everything figured out, but I was finally starting to trust myself. Sometimes, all it takes is meeting the right person at the right time to shift your perspective. For me, that person was a random hitchhiker named Lucas. And while I'll probably never see him again, I'll always be grateful for the lesson he taught me: life is short, and you have to be willing to take risks if you want to live it fully.